Welcome back to the Bricks. We are super excited to welcome Justin Williams, staff writer for The Athletic, to the pod tonight to talk about the UC Bearcats. The news in the 5-1-3, the Bearcats are looking good. They're undefeated. They're looking like they're going to win the American. They're looking like they might even have a chance to compete for the college football playoff. We'll talk about all that and more with Justin. But first of all, Justin, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great. I appreciate you guys having me. It's an honor. Any OU connection I can make with people is always a good one. Probably not what people want to hear on a UC podcast, but
Oh, you're good. You're totally good. So that was actually perfect because Justin's actually a Miami grad. So that is absolutely perfect. So
well,
that's right where we get the name, Battle of the Bricks, back to the bricks. So same kind of concept. But
right. Okay.
but
So
yeah, absolutely. We're
I
definitely
now I know who my favorite host is. That's
that's
good to know.
that's right. So feel
Love and
free to
honor.
not answer any of his questions. But let's start right with the recent victory over UCF, unranked UCF with 2 losses already early in the season. But statistically speaking, and I know you talked about this on Twitter recently, the best total offense in the country. How would you just right off the bat rate the Bearcats' performance?
Yeah, I mean, I think I wrote this too. I don't know. You could argue whether it was their most impressive win. I mean, I think the SMU road win would be up there for that. Same with the Memphis home win, especially just knowing that Memphis beat them twice last year. But it was definitely the toughest win they've had, and that's not surprising. I mean, Fickell talked about it last week leading up to this game. Everyone I talked to kind of involved with the team, they knew the offense was really good. The defense, which statistically is not good, but they're fast. They have a lot of good athletes, so they knew it wasn't just going to be anything easy. And for whatever reason, I mean, even though it was 20% capacity or whatever, going down there and playing in the bounce house, like that's not easy. You're going on the road anyways. So even though I know they lost to Tulsa, and then Memphis came back in that crazy game, but there just seemed, at least among the team, there seemed to be this idea like this was going to be their toughest game, and it certainly played out that way. And things didn't go well to start. UC kind of put themselves in a hole, but they were able to fight that off and come back a couple different times. And I was pretty impressed. I guess I thought they would win going into it, but just kind of the way that they were able to execute, especially after falling behind. I thought it sent a pretty good message. Anyone that's watched that UCF team the past couple of years, this year included, knows how good they are, how quick they can score. So even though on the stat sheet scoreline it might not look like their most impressive win, I think you can make a case for it.
Absolutely. And going to UCF is a big deal. I remember a couple of years ago, game day was down there when UC went down there, and it kind of got ugly early in that game and wasn't as good. Of course, it was Fickell's that really first year he had his guys, and they were really good. But I would imagine that's kind of why it was such a big deal for the Bearcats is trying to get that revenge for that trip when they kind of got embarrassed in that game. Is that the vibe that was coming from the locker room and all that kind of stuff last week, or was that out of memory, out of mind?
No, I mean they definitely remember it, and how much they want to talk to the media about it, I don't know. I was at that game in 2018, the college game day game, and they just, you're right. That was kind of the year they won 11 games, and they kind of first came onto the scene. But like they didn't belong on that field with UCF. They got run off the field by them. It was pretty clear that they weren't in the same class as them, and. I don't think they played Memphis that year, if I remember correctly. But it was kind of one of those situations where they weren't quite there yet. And that's why last year was such a big deal when they were able to get them at home. And I think that kind of maybe took care of some of the stuff from the year before. But definitely, we talked to Derek Forrest after the game, and, he said it wasn't really talked about that much leading up to it, but he was in that game. He knows how bad they played. And that was definitely probably in the back of their minds. Des Ritter, he had a pretty bad game, had 3 fumbles that game in 2018. So whether they want to talk about it or say it out loud, these guys know what the deal is. So I definitely think it was in the back of their head going back there. And just the idea of, yeah, they got them last year, but it was an upset even though they were at home. UCF was the ranked team. This year was kind of flipped. UC had the target on their back. And so I think a lot of the things they've been doing this year, they know they're good. They know they're favored in a lot of these games, but they almost go out there wanting to prove that they deserve that. And so far that's what they've been able to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so
I think right away you saw with the way that UCF was talking early in the game that even if you would have gone in there saying, okay, this isn't about revenge in the bounce house, like early on there were a lot of dudes chirping. And so I think pretty quickly it was very clear for UC that it was going to have to be a game that they won both physically and and with their mouths, quite honestly, too. I think they did a good job backing it up personally.
Yeah, and that's been their thing. This whole tough and nasty ethos that they've kind of preached under Fickell. Like they want to bully people and they want to push them around, and they've been able to do it the past 2 years, a little bit by surprise sometimes. Well, now that's not the case. So they know they're going to get everybody's best shot. They know they're going to have people chirping at them, during the game or before the game, leading up to it on Twitter or whatever. So they're prepared for that, and I think kind of the next level is to be able to be the team that everyone's taking shots at and still be able to win those games and still be able to bully people. And they've been able to do that. And, I think that's a mark. Fickell's talked about this. It's easier to go from not so good to good than it is to go good to great. And that's kind of what they're in the middle of doing. And it's been really impressive.
Absolutely. So that kind of plays into, so my family is high school football coaches here in Southwest Ohio. I know a lot of high school football coaches here in Southwest Ohio, and I know Coach Fickell has set up the state of Cincinnati kind of feel for him. And the stat that they gave on Saturday that there's 80 guys on the roster from the state of Ohio. And a lot of those guys, Josh Wiley, personally, I coached against Josh Wiley when he was at LaSalle High School. So that's kind of cool.
Did he talk a bunch of trash in high school too?
You better believe it. You better believe it. Ryan Montgomery, I coached against him at Franklin High School. So it's just kind of cool for those guys. But do you think that adds kind of a chip to the shoulder already, seeing how Southwest Ohio talks about how they have the best football around? Fickell's recruiting that it's the best. Is it all just playing into his favor of playing into that, as you said, ethos that it's Ohio against the world kind of thing, Cincinnati against the world?
Yeah, I think so. Honestly, I think they've done a really good job, the staff, of cultivating that idea that like this is the cool thing to do is to stay home at Cincinnati, whether you're from Cincinnati or you're from Columbus or Ohio. They do a good job of making it feel like home, even as they get farther out from the actual city. But I think that's important because that wasn't the case before. No one who grew up here, unless you had a family member that played there or something like that, no one who grew up in Cincinnati playing football, that was a dream to go play at UC. And they started by making it like, all right, maybe it's not your dream, but you can come here and you can play. Jarrell White talked about that. He knew he could come to Cincinnati and play right away for 4 years. It wasn't like it was a dream for him necessarily as a dream school, but now that started to change as they've started to win. They started to build this, Fickell staying, Freeman staying, all these things kind of add to that. And you start getting guys like Wiley and Malik Van and, Evan Prater, obviously, Jaheim Thomas. The more it happens, you got to remember, these are 15 to 18-year-old kids that are making this decision. So they're really impressionable. So when they see like, oh yeah, the big kid in town, the star football player at Wyoming, star quarterback picks Cincinnati. All right, that's going to seem really cool. I'm going to do that too. So the staff has done a good job of making that kind of the culture and part of it, so that when those guys get there, there is a sense of pride that otherwise they would have taken somewhere else. And, now they don't feel the need to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Evan Prater was a stud basketball player too, let me tell you. I saw that firsthand as well. So he was pretty good on the floor too. So
I don't doubt it.
Yeah, so moving forward, kind of talking about 2020 as the Fickell year, maybe a year removed from really playing with a full roster of his guys and a full roster of Ohio guys. Do you think this is the ceiling under Fickell?
Well, I guess it depends how this year ends. I mean, if they go 11-0 and they sneak into the playoff, then that's probably the ceiling, because that's pretty much everyone's ceiling. Even if they get smoked by Bama or something, because that's except for 3 or 4 teams, that's everyone's ceiling too. But I don't know, because right now, yeah, probably, but it's no secret the program has hopes of getting to a bigger conference, and I don't think Fickell would have signed that extension and stayed around if he was just content to stay in the American Conference, or at least stay in the American and not still compete for college football playoff spots and all that kind of stuff. So I hesitate to call it the ceiling. I would basically say if they get to the conference football playoff, or college football playoff, or even if they're right on the outside, if they're 11-0 and all the talk is, should Cincinnati get a chance, should they get in, and they end up getting the New Year's Six Bowl, in some ways that's almost just as good, because you're right there in the discussion, and you can pull a UCF and claim you have a national championship, all that kind of stuff. So that would be him maximizing, I think, the potential they have right now. But as unrealistic or pipe dream as it is, Fickell would say anything short of like a national championship, wouldn't be the ceiling. Now, the way it's set up right now, that would be really tough, but that's kind of the way they would frame it. And him looking forward, that's the way he would think about it. But yeah, I would say if they go 11-0 and are, top 6 or 7 in the final CFP rankings, that's him maximizing anything they could have possibly done this season.
Yeah, absolutely. You kind of touched on it, but the idea of UC trying to jump and go somewhere else bigger, I know a few years ago, obviously they were trying to go to the ACC or the Big 12. And personally, my mom went to Louisville, so I'm a big Louisville fan. And Louisville managed to do that 1 year in the American transition year and then get to the ACC. And that's turned out really well for the majority of their athletics and the majority of their pocketbooks. But obviously, I think you're right. I think it's all about the way that it's portrayed. Right? If UC's in the picture, and Fickell can continue to recruit the state well, continue to recruit other talent well, make his recruiting classes go higher and higher each year, then, that does sell the program a little bit more. And there are other conferences that are paying attention. So let's get to the college football playoff. Where do you want to start with the college football playoff? What do you think is the first conversation that has to start with UC?
I mean, this is like super, TV color commentator, but like they have to go 11-0 first. Even they could lose a game and still, as long as it's not the conference title game, they could still then go on and win the conference title. They could even potentially still host it if they lose to, Tulsa or Temple this weekend, which seems highly unlikely based on the way Temple's been playing. But so if we're going to start from the premise that they go 11-0 and win the conference title game, I don't know. I still find it highly unlikely they'll get in. I know that's not what some people want to hear, but just, even if, I know everyone talked about, well, if Notre Dame would have beat Clemson, that would have, maybe given them a little chance to climb higher or something like that. Maybe. I still think like you're going to have a lot of stuff go right for them to get in, meaning like Ohio State losing to Illinois or something crazy like that. And, on down the line for some of those other teams, you're going to need 2 or 3 really good teams to take like some shocking losses, and that probably won't happen. But I think you can, if you can get to the playoff, you want to go to the playoff, even if that means getting smoked by Bama or Clemson or whoever. But you could make a case that it could work out really well for them if they're in the conversation. They go to a New Year's Six bowl and they beat Texas A&M or Georgia or something like that. Basically, kind of the UCF model from a couple of years ago, because then you were the team that got left out as opposed to the team that got let in and got beat or something like that. So if they have their choice, they're going to get in. But if you're just asking me what I think, even if they do everything they're supposed to do, I just don't think it's set up. The system is set up to let them in.
I thought you had an interesting point. I saw it on Twitter about how A&M and Florida might have a better best win, but UC's body of work is better. What is so there's just people who are loyal to the Power 5 and don't recognize the Power 6 like we do on this podcast. But we personally on our rankings have UC at 5. And so that's where you have them too. How do you sell that SMU, Memphis, and UCF look better than, beating some SEC teams who might be terrible, but they're still SEC teams? How do you justify that beating those American teams are better than beating low-end SEC teams?
Yeah, so first I got to give credit. That's Chris Vanini's rankings on The Athletic who put that out today. I tend to agree with Chris on that point. And the reason Chris put that is because Chris watches the games. Chris knows these teams. He watches American Athletic Conference football, so he knows how good they are. As opposed to, it's kind of the same thing when you talk about like the selection committee with the NCAA tournament. Like, are you watching the mid-majors to give them a fair shake? So I think that's part of it, is whether it's public perception, or the actual NCAA, CFP selection committee, you kind of got to change people's minds, which is the American is not, it's better than it was a few years ago. Yeah, you could look at some of these metrics that say, oh, it's as good as the ACC or as good as the ACC without Clemson or something like that. I don't know. I don't know what UC would do if they were playing in the SEC or the Big Ten this year. I don't know that they'd be 8-0 right now. That's not necessarily the point. The point is just like, look at some of these other teams in these conferences and realize that maybe ECU doesn't stack up with them. Maybe even like Tulane, who's kind of decent, or Houston, who can be kind of frisky sometimes. Yeah, okay, maybe they can't hack it against some of the power conference teams. But UCF and Memphis, those are legit squads. SMU, those are legit teams, and you have to take into account that even if they weren't, beating a top 10 Florida team or something like that, that going on the road and smoking 17 SMU or whatever they were at the time, like, that's, if that were, I don't know, pick your, this year would be like Northwestern or, Iowa State, that you'd probably get a lot more respect for that than if it's SMU next to it. So I think it's just kind of getting over that, preconceived notion idea. But that takes time. And I think it takes teams like what Cincinnati's doing this year to kind of even lift the whole profile of the conference.
Yeah, we talk a lot on the pod about recency bias, and you tweeted a Luke Fickell quote from after the game on Saturday that was kind of similar to the idea of, until you have the style points right now are more like what's on your chest, what your team is, what your recent success is. We talk a lot about that when we talk about Alabama and Clemson and Ohio State, and really what I think it boils down to is the head coach, and really when the committee sits down and says, okay, maybe here's what the Vegas spread is against this team. And okay, what could Nick Saban do in 2 weeks of prep? Well, Nick Saban can get a team that's his B- team and get him to play at an A- and beat, all but maybe one team in college football. And so I think that those are the conversations that are had that aren't public, but there are definitely conversations that, like you said, like we don't necessarily want to put Cincinnati in or put BYU in, which won't be in the conversation in my opinion, but just another example, and get absolutely trounced, get beat like Kentucky did to Alabama the other day and, get 60 hung on them. We don't want that to happen as a perception, thing. And there's money involved and there's all those things involved too. But I think what Fickell was getting at is true, is that you have to kind of establish yourself first in order to be trusted in that scenario. And Justin knows this. He's also a Notre Dame fan. He knows that, Notre Dame has been burned a few times and they've burned the committee. And so now the committee doesn't trust them as willingly. So do you think that Cincinnati is going to have to just keep plugging away for a few more years to really get that foot in the door, and that this year is more of a first step and less of a trying to get to the mountaintop?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, going back to the whole style points thing, like Luke understands that better than anybody. He's, a born and bred Buckeye. He coached there for 20 years. He worked at a place where the expectation was national title, day one of every season. So he gets that. I mean, I do think there's truth to this, might be their best shot this season under the current landscape, because even if Oregon goes 7-0, like they're still 7-0, and it's, it feels weird though that they started so late, or, they're only playing these conference games, so they don't have any of the, cross P5 games to reference something against. So in that sense, yeah, maybe if the committee's just like, well, we saw Texas A&M get their ass kicked by Alabama, let's give Cincinnati a chance to get their ass kicked by Alabama. That might be their best chance to get in. I do think everyone's talking about it expanding to 8, and depending on how that shakes out, you could make the argument that what Cincinnati does this year would set them up really well, if something like that happens. But Cincinnati will be good next year and the year after that, but there's also kind of a special quality to this team just in terms of some of the juniors and seniors they have. As good as a defense as they have, in years to come, it probably not going to be quite as good as this year. So I think part of in the back of Fickell's mind or anyone's mind is like, this might be our best shot because of all those things. Let's do what we can to get in there. And I think if they got to 11-0, you would see a tone shift in Fickell, and I think you'd see him kind of out there like pounding the pavement, making that case. But I think he also knows it's going to be fruitless if he does it now and they end up losing. So I'll be interested to see that, because I do think he might turn up the volume a little bit when we get to that point, and that'll be interesting to see how the public and the committee reacts to that if we get there.
Yeah, I think it was even a few weeks ago that he made a reference about not knowing what their ranking was or something, and I think that was kind of the start of that conversation of like, oh yeah, we're not too worried about it. But I think you're completely right. I think a tone shift is definitely coming. So let's put you on the spot here. Tomorrow night the rankings come out. When we're recording tomorrow night, the rankings come out for the first college football playoff top 25. They are meeting in person, which is very controversial in my opinion, and probably not the right decision. Unlike us, they are meeting in person. Where do you think the UC Bearcats will be?
So I actually think they'll be 7, which is where they are in the AP and the Coaches Bowl. But apparently that would be like historical, because the highest, I believe the highest a group of 5 programs ever gotten is 8 in the CFP rankings. But just looking at it, like, in the AP poll, BYU's right behind them. Wisconsin and Indiana were there last week. They just lost. Like, I think the really only sensible one that could jump them would be if they put Oregon ahead of them, which what are they, 3-0 now? I guess it's
Mhm.
possible, but they don't seem no one seems super impressed with Oregon. Or like Northwestern, and honestly, that seems just as crazy as putting Cincinnati up there. I think people would view that kind of the same way. So yeah, my guess is it'll be 7. And again, that's as much about the circumstances surrounding everything as it is, Cincinnati making history or anything like that with that ranking. But if someone jumps above them, I'll be interested to hear the justification for that. I can understand the justification of Florida and Texas A&M being above them in the rankings, even if there's parts I don't agree with that. I think if Cincinnati didn't play for 2 weeks, they'd drop a lot more than Texas A&M has. But I'd have a hard time buying it if someone else sneaks up and they in like 8th or 9th or something.
Random question for you here. So I got stirred up by BYU last night turning down Washington. So
Allegedly.
Yeah. So let's say Temple, it's not crazy, says they can't play this Saturday, and Washington calls up UC. Is Fickell playing that game this weekend? Is he playing Washington to help his chances to get into the college football playoff?
I could see him doing that for a couple of reasons. The whole thing about the BYU game on the 5th, or that open weekend, BYU would have to come to Nippert. Like, Fickell doesn't want to play 4 straight road games. Now, if it's like playing this weekend because Temple cancels, that's a different situation because you would technically still have a bye week. Playing Washington or anyone outside of conference doesn't hurt their chances to host and win the conference title, even if they would go somewhere and lose. But he would think about it. Like, he definitely wouldn't shut it down. I don't think Washington wants to. That's the thing. I don't think one of these teams wants Cincinnati to come play them. Like, they figured that out when they lost the Nebraska game and tried to cancel it. Like, they were calling around schools, Notre Dame, Pitt, places like that, and none of these people want to play them. They might have gone to Notre Dame and lost. Obviously, they might do that next year too. But Notre Dame, they have enough people on that staff that know this team well enough not to take that chance. So I would be shocked if like Washington or somebody did that to them. But whether it actually happened, I at least know it wouldn't be an automatic no from Fickell. He would weigh it for sure.
Yeah, I think that's a great conversation. I think the thing I'm going to watch tomorrow is where teams like Oklahoma, Texas, Georgia are ranked. These are teams, especially Georgia, that historically the committee loves. And there's never really a huge reason for it. I mean, Georgia has not had an outstanding quarterback for 5-6 years at this point. I mean, this is the team that willingly gave Justin Fields to Ohio State. And if they would have had him last year, probably would have been a pretty dang good team. But all that to say, I think it'll be really interesting to see where the committee puts those kind of teams. And if those teams are like 9, 10, 11, UC has absolutely zero chance, because that tells you all that the committee values. And I think that's what worries me the most, is that if like UC starts at 6 or 7 and we just see this gradual slow drop back to like 9 or 10 because they value Power 5 football. So I think those are some things to look out for, but I definitely hope that the committee, they don't do, in my opinion, in our opinion, they don't do their due diligence very often when they don't have to. They don't do a whole lot of work. I mean, if you look at every year except one, I believe all 4 teams are what the BCS would have given you, maybe a slightly different seed, but it's the same thing that the computer would have shot out. So I'd hope that they, they have some, actual minds and conversations there, but we'll definitely see.
Yeah, it'll be interesting too, because it's one thing to say like, oh, Cincinnati's really good, they're 7th or whatever, but then it's like BYU's behind them, and then you're getting into the Northwesterns and the Coastal Carolinas, and like some of these people are going to be confused to look at this and be like, well, how high do we put Coastal Carolina in the CFP? They're not going to be that high, but they're going to be a lot higher than traditional power conference teams or whatever. So it will be really interesting to see how the whole top 25 shakes out. And yeah, I'm kind of with you. Let's prove to me that they've done their due diligence, I guess. So we'll see.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to kind of transition and kind of wrap up here, I wanted to definitely shout out your article that you wrote about Brannon today, the coach of the UC Bearcat basketball team. Really, really good article. Good read. I believe you've worked on it for quite a while, but talks a lot about last season. You're welcome to touch on it a little bit, but kind of just looking forward to basketball. And we've kind of talked briefly on the podcast about whether or not basketball is going to happen and whether or not it'll shake out, maybe a couple of weeks and then kind of blow up from there. But what's kind of your read on the UC basketball program as it's game week?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's hard to say just because of how weird this offseason has been and the lead up has been. I mean, probably since we've been talking, there's been a basketball game this week that's gotten canceled. So assuming that everything goes off as, well and normal as possible, I think it'll be a transition season. Like, in that sounds bad. I don't want it to sound, the way it sounds, but that's always kind of the way this was going to be when John took the job. I think he realized, all right, I got guys like Jaron and Trey and Keith coming back. Those guys are too good to just completely strip it down and rebuild, which in a lot of cases is what would have happened. Him taking over a job like that. So I give him credit for kind of the way he built the team last year. And then that kind of forced the way he had to build the team this year, because he still had Keith coming back and, Mamadou, obviously, but it was still, you can't it's hard to get 7 new freshmen and bring them in. So you still had to kind of go to the transfer market. And I think they liked the way everything, shook out with that and the roster they put together, but they kind of had to do the same thing as last year. And I think it's fair to say they're not as good a team as last year because of who they lost, from that squad. So I actually think it'll probably go similar to last season. It's a smaller non-conference, which hurts them, but it'll probably be a little bumpy to start at times. Even if it's some games they win, they'll probably have stretches where it's like, well, they just haven't figured it out yet. But if they get the opportunity and are able to play as many games as possible, I think towards the middle end of conference play, you'll start to see, the team figure it out and kind of, find their identity. So I think it could look the same as last year. The problem is this season isn't going to look the same as last year, just, from a logistical standpoint. So hopefully that doesn't hurt them. But I'm excited to go out there and see. I'm excited to see what Keith looks like as the guy. I'm excited to see some of the young guys. I hope people will realize that and appreciate that and not just be so one-track focused on conference title, NCAA tournament, but more like you got a really, I think, promising young group of freshmen, and they might not totally look it or be ready this year, but maybe seeing the potential for what this team could look like in a couple of years.
Yeah, as forgiving as Bearcat fans seem to be with Fickell when he first got here, they weren't so much with Brannon, which makes sense because of all the success that Mick Cronin had in having guys like Jaron Cumberland and those guys on the roster. But still, it's an overhaul, it's a change, it's a complete change of philosophy. So you got to give Brannon some time to get things figured out. And I will be checking out your article. So I hadn't checked it out yet, but I'll be checking it out. So we're big fans of the Bearcats here. We'll be big fans of the Bearcats as we roll into basketball season. Justin, thanks for coming on. Is there anything you would like to say about your work or anything you have coming up that's exciting that you want people to know about, or anything you want to say to wrap us up here?
No, I appreciate that. Obviously the Brandon piece today, it's hard to kind of do those big feature stories, especially, in the middle of the season, but I was happy with the way that came out. I appreciate the Brandon family kind of giving me the access and telling the story they did. So if people, I know a subscription site can be a commitment, but if people are on the fence and, needed something to push them over the edge, hopefully that story could do it for them. But other than that, yeah, I mean, anybody checking out my work on The Athletic, I appreciate, but I also just appreciate the entire fan base and kind of the way they make this job fun and easy to do, and appreciate people like you guys having me on to talk about it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Justin. We'll check out Justin on Twitter and on The Athletic as well. Thanks.
Thanks, guys.